Robert Baratheon is one of the most misread characters in the entire series. The show introduces him as a fat, drunk, whoring king who stumbles through the halls of the Red Keep complaining about money and chasing serving girls while the people around him run his kingdom into the ground. That is who Robert Baratheon became. It is not who Robert Baratheon was. And understanding the gap between those two versions of the same man is one of the most interesting things you can do with this entire story. Because the man who died on that hunting trip was not the man who won Robert's rebellion. The man who won Robert's rebellion was one of the most naturally gifted military commanders and instinctive political operators in the history of Westeros. And almost nobody talks about him that way. Starting with who Robert actually was before the throne, before the rebellion, before Lyanna, before any of it. Robert Baratheon was already something exceptional. He was Lord of Storm's End, one of the great ancient castles of Westeros, and he had grown up alongside Ned Stark and Jon Arryn at the Eyrie as wards of Lord Arryn. That arrangement was not accidental. It was the feudal system doing exactly what it was designed to do, creating bonds between the heirs of great houses that would translate into political alliances a generation later. Robert grew up understanding instinctively that power was relational. You built it through people, through loyalty, through the kind of personal connection that made men want to follow you, not because they had to, but because they genuinely could not imagine following anyone else. He was also physically extraordinary. Every account in both the show and the books describes the young Robert as something close to a force of nature. Massive, powerful, magnetic, with a warhammer that most men could not lift, let alone wield, effectively in battle. Ned tells Joffrey in the first season that Robert was a great warrior once. That is an understatement so enormous it borders on dishonest. Robert was not a great warrior the way a skilled swordsman is a great warrior. He was a great warrior the way a natural disaster is unstoppable. He did not win fights through technique. He won them through an overwhelming combination of physical power, aggression, and a battlefield instinct that cannot be taught. In the books, this is described in even more vivid detail. Characters who fought alongside Robert during the rebellion speak about him with a reverence that the show only gestures at. His warhammer became almost mythological. The way he moved through a battle, the way enemy formations simply collapsed when he hit them, was the kind of thing that men who survived it never stopped talking about. He was the weapon. Everything else was logistics, the spark that started everything. The rebellion did not begin because Robert Baratheon sat down and designed a political strategy. It began because Prince Rhaegar Targaryen either abducted or ran away with Lyanna Stark, depending on which version of events you believe, and because Lyanna's brother Brandon rode to King's Landing to demand answers and was burned alive by the mad King Aerys, along with his father Rickard. Those deaths triggered the rebellion. Robert's fury over Lyanna was the emotional engine, but fury alone does not topple a dynasty. Fury needs architecture. Here is where Robert's instinctive genius becomes visible. He understood immediately, either consciously or through pure instinct, that this could not be his war alone. A single lord rising against the Iron Throne was a rebellion. Multiple great houses rising together was a revolution, and Robert had exactly the relationships needed to make that happen. Jon Arryn was his guardian and surrogate father. The Vale came with Jon Arryn. Ned Stark was his closest friend since childhood. The North came with Ned Stark. House Tully was brought in through marriage, Ned marrying Catelyn Tully and Jon Arryn marrying Lysa Tully in the early stages of the conflict, which secured the Riverland. In the span of what amounted to a very short political window, Robert had assembled a coalition of houses controlling the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands simultaneously. That is more than half of Westeros aligned against the crown before the first major battle had even been fought. This did not happen by accident. It happened because Robert had spent his entire young life building the exact relationships that made it possible. He had not planned the rebellion, but he had, without necessarily intending to, prepared for it completely. The Battle of Summerhall. The early days of Robert's rebellion showed immediately that the man leading it was not a figurehead. Robert won 3 battles in a single day at Summerhall, defeating 3 separate royalist forces that had converged on his position with the apparent intention of crushing rebellion before it could gain momentum. 3 battles, 1 day. Each one won decisively enough that the royalist strategy of early overwhelming force completely failed. Think about what that required. Not just physical courage, though it required enormous physical courage. It required the ability to assess 3 separate tactical situations rapidly, deploy limited forces effectively across multiple engagements, maintain the morale and cohesion of an army fighting continuously, and win each engagement cleanly enough to be ready for the next one. That is not a man swinging a hammer blindly. That is a commander operating at a level that most professional soldiers never reach. In the books, the Battle of Summerhall Summerhall is discussed by characters like Barristan Selmy, who was fighting on the other side, with genuine military respect. Selmy, one of the greatest knights in the history of Westeros, acknowledges Robert's ability as a battlefield commander in terms that carry real weight coming from someone of his stature. When your enemy's greatest knight talks about you that way, you are doing something extraordinary. The Battle of Ashford followed shortly after, and Robert lost it, which is worth mentioning because it shows something important. He was not invincible. He was not unbeatable. He took a defeat, regrouped, and kept moving. The ability to absorb a loss without losing momentum or fracturing the coalition behind you is a form of leadership that is genuinely rare. Many commanders who had never lost before collapsed when it finally happened. Robert treated Ashford as a temporary setback and continued north. The Trident. If Summerhall showed Robert's tactical ability, the Battle of the Trident showed his capacity for the single defining moment that changes everything. Rhaegar Targaryen rode out to meet him personally. The Crown Prince, the heir to the Iron Throne, one of the most romanticized and feared figures in Westerosi history, chose to end the rebellion by personal combat in the middle of a pitched battle. Robert killed him. He drove his warhammer into Rhaegar's chest with enough force to scatter the rubies from his armor across the river. The image of those red stones sinking into the water became one of the defining images of the entire era. Robert did not just defeat Rhaegar militarily, he ended him completely. He took the symbol of Targaryen legitimacy and destroyed it in front of both armies. The psychological impact of that moment cannot be overstated. Rhaegar was not just a crown prince, he was a legend in his own lifetime. Poets wrote songs about him, knights dreamed of serving him. He was supposed to be the figure that prophecy and history were building toward. Robert Baratheon walked into that river and ended that narrative with a single swing of a hammer. After the Trident, the rebellion was effectively over. The question was no longer whether Robert would win, but how quickly the remaining Targaryen loyalists would accept it. In the books, the Trident is described through multiple perspectives, and each one adds something. Barristan Selmy, who was wounded trying to reach the battle, carries the guilt of not being there to protect Rhaegar for the rest of his life. Jaime Lannister, who was in King's Landing at the time, describes the aftermath in terms that make clear how completely the Trident broke the royalist cause. Characters who were children at the time speak about the battle the way people speak about historical turning points, with the particular reverence reserved for moments that divided everything into before and after. Sacking King's Landing and the political masterstroke nobody credits him for. When King's Landing fell, it fell in a way that could easily have become a catastrophe for Robert's rebellion. Tywin Lannister arrived at the gates with the Lannister army and asked to be let in. The city opened its gates. The Lannisters sacked it. Jaime Lannister killed the Mad King on the Iron Throne while the king's own Kingsguard stood down. The city was burning from the wildfire caches Aerys had prepared. It was chaos. Robert arrived to find King's Landing taken by an army that had not fought in his rebellion, led by a lord who had waited carefully to see which side would win before committing. Tywin Lannister had not bled for this. He had calculated and then swooped in at the final moment to position himself on the winning side. A lesser man, or a more emotionally reactive one, might have treated that as a betrayal or a challenge. Robert did the opposite. He incorporated it. He accepted Tywin's support as the political reality it was, understood that punishing the Lannisters for opportunism would only create new enemies at the moment he most needed stability, and cemented the alliance by marrying Cersei Lannister. It was the right political decision executed at exactly the right moment. Robert needed the Westerlands, and he needed Tywin Lannister neutralized as a potential future threat. One marriage accomplished both. This is the Robert that people forget existed, not the drunk at the feast table, the man who ended a war cleanly, built a workable coalition from the ruins of a dynasty, and made the pragmatic peace that turned military victory into actual governance. That required intelligence of a specific kind that the show barely acknowledges he ever possessed. In the books, the political settlement after the rebellion is described in more detail, and Robert's role in it is more active. He makes decisions about the surviving Targaryen, about which lords to reward and which to watch carefully, about how to structure a court that could function without the apparatus the Targaryens had built over 300 years. He is not the genius administrator that Tywin was, but he is not the passive drunk the show retrospectively implies either. He is a man doing the best he can with an entirely new set of problems he had not expected to be his. Where it all collapsed. The tragedy of Robert Baratheon is not that he was stupid, it is that he was built for one thing and asked to do another for the rest of his life.
So here we sit, 17 years later, holding it all together. Don't you get tired
War gave Robert everything his nature required: clear enemies, physical expression of his ability, the loyalty of men who depended on him and whom he could protect through direct action, purpose that matched his strengths so precisely that he was genuinely extraordinary at it. Kingship gave him none of those things. Kingship was paperwork, politics, and the management of people who hated each other in ways that could not be resolved by hitting anyone with a hammer. Kingship was sitting still while other people talked and then making decisions whose consequences you would not see for years. Robert was constitutionally incapable of finding meaning in any of it. He told Ned Stark in the very first episode that he had been sitting on the Iron Throne for 17 years and it was the most boring throne in the world. That line is played for laughs, but it is actually heartbreaking. This is a man who conquered a continent and found the conquest meaningless the moment it was complete. He had no idea what to do with peace. He had spent his entire young life preparing for a war, and nobody had thought to prepare him for what came after. The drinking, the hunting, the women, the spending, all of it is the behavior of a man who has been separated from the one context in which he knew who he was. He was not lazy or corrupt in the way that some kings are lazy and corrupt. He was lost, genuinely, completely lost, in a role that demanded everything he was worst at and offered nothing he was good at in return. In the books, this dimension of Robert is explored with more patience and more sympathy. Characters who knew him before the rebellion describe the transformation with genuine sadness. Ned Stark in particular carries a grief about what Robert became that goes deeper than simple disappointment. He had loved the young Robert completely. The man he came south to serve his hand was someone he recognized physically but barely recognized in any other way. The books frame Robert's decline not as moral failure but as a kind of prolonged, wine-soaked mourning for a version of himself that the throne had made impossible to sustain. Lyanna is the key to all of it. This needs to be said directly because the show only half commits to it. Robert Baratheon never stopped loving Lyanna Stark. He said her name at Jon Arryn's funeral. He visited her tomb in the crypts of Winterfell before he did almost anything else after arriving in the north. He kept a locket with her image in it. He told Ned that Cersei had never been and could never be Lyanna. He spent 17 years on the Iron Throne, essentially haunted by a woman who had been dead since before his reign began. What the show and the books both eventually reveal, and what Robert never knew, is that Lyanna had not been taken against her will. She had gone with Rhaegar voluntarily. She had loved him. She had died giving birth to his son, the boy Robert would have killed without hesitation, the boy Ned raised as his own bastard and named Jon Snow. Robert's entire rebellion, the war that killed tens of thousands of people, the event that ended one dynasty and installed another, was built on a misunderstanding. Or more precisely, it was built on a truth that was only partial. Rhaegar did take Lyanna. The consequences were real. The deaths were real. But the story Robert told himself about it, the story of a woman stolen from him by a monster, was not the whole truth. And Robert spent the rest of his life inside that story, drinking himself to death in a castle he had won, fighting for someone who had chosen someone else. He never knew, and that ignorance shaped everything. His treatment of Cersei, his relationship with his children, his inability to find peace in anything the throne offered him, all of it flows from a grief that was real but built on an incomplete picture of what had actually happened. In the books, this is handled with even greater care. The revelation about Lyanna and Rhaegar is built slowly across thousands of pages through fragments and implications and the memories of characters who knew pieces of the truth without knowing all of it. By the time Jon Snow's parentage becomes fully clear, the reader has been sitting with Robert's grief long enough to understand exactly how devastating the full truth would have been if he had ever learned it. Robert Baratheon conquered the world. He won a war that should not have been winnable, built a coalition from nothing, killed the crown prince in single combat, and turned military victory into a functioning political settlement through a combination of instinct, relationships, and pragmatism that nobody in this story gives him credit for. And then he sat on the throne he had won and drank himself slowly to death because the one thing he had ever truly wanted was in a tomb in Winterfell, and no amount of conquest had ever come close to filling that particular hole. He was not a great king. He was never going to be a great king, but he was something rarer and more interesting than a great king. He was a man whose greatest moment was also the beginning of his longest defeat, and understanding that is the only way to understand Robert Baratheon completely.